Hello, my name is Adrian Ferrari, and I want to thank you so much for just taking a couple of minutes to join me today as we ask and hopefully answer one very important question, and it's this. If one of your elders were to resign tomorrow, who would replace them? Would you already know who God has been preparing, or would you at that moment begin searching for someone? Because unfortunately, many churches don't begin thinking about leadership until there's a leadership vacancy. Whether a ministry expands or someone moves away or a teacher steps down, and then suddenly we're looking for volunteers instead of intentionally developing leaders. And the problem is that churches don't care about leadership. The problem is that many churches have a leadership development plan, but they don't have a leadership identification plan. Because before we can develop leaders, we first have to recognize that God is already preparing somebody. And today I want to share a very simple biblical framework that has helped me shape the leadership philosophy behind what I call the David Leadership Development Cohort. And I call it very simply the David process. So everything begins in 1 Samuel chapter 16. So if you think about it, Saul has died and God sends Samuel to Bethlehem to anoint the next king. And as Samuel arrives to Jesse's house, he begins asking for his sons. And he sees that first son. He sees Eliab. And he looks at him and he's strong and he looks courageous and he's confident. And Samuel says, "Oh, surely this is the Lord's anointed." But God stops him because in 1 Samuel 16:7, he says this. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. For man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Now, I want you to think about this. Samuel, yes, he was a prophet, yet even Samuel himself was evaluating leadership the way that people naturally do. He looked on the appearance, but yet God said, "Hold on a second. No. I look at their character." And this is what I want you to think about, right? David wasn't even invited to the party here. His own father overlooked him. His brothers overlooked him. Even Samuel overlooked him, but God didn't. And churches make the exact same mistake because we tend to focus on the person who outside of church is a leader in business, for example, in their secular world, or maybe they just have an outgoing personality or they're just a good communicator. Now, while none of those things are wrong, we always have to go back to scripture because according to scripture, that is not where leadership identification begins. Because God develops a person's heart. And that's what we need to look at. Because how do we identify future leaders the way that God does? Well, if we look at the David process, we're going to look at DAVID. You ready? So David, number one, depend on God. The first step is so simple. Depend on God. Now, Samuel didn't discover David because he had some sort of exceptional judgment. Samuel discovered David because God revealed him. And James chapter 1 reminds us that if we lack wisdom, all we have to do is ask God. And leadership identification begins with prayer. Begins with us just falling on our face and saying, "Lord, before I begin this process, before I start looking at the outward appearance of others, Lord, show me who you have already been preparing." Don't just look at who is available. Lord, who have you been preparing? That is where leadership identification begins, on our knees. And then we assess the heart. And this is where a lot of churches get distracted because, again, we tend to always drift towards talent. God evaluates character. So what in the world should we actually observe, right? Does this man receive correction? Is he teachable? Does he demonstrate humility? Is he growing spiritually? Does he genuinely love Christ and others and his family? Does he serve others? Because now those aren't personality traits. Those are observable indicators of spiritual maturity. And one statement that I've come to believe is this: you can teach ministry skills. You cannot manufacture godly character. Because character is formed over years of walking with Christ. So yes, we depend on God. On our face, we assess the heart. And then V, we verify faithfulness. Because character isn't assumed, it's observed. Anyone can impress people for a couple of weeks, but we need to ask ourselves through time, is this person dependable? Do they keep their commitments? Do they attend worship? And I think it very important, do they serve when no one is watching? Because think about it, David was not in a position of authority. David was out in the field watching sheep on a day-to-day basis, just serving. And we need to ask ourselves, is this person, or we need to ask ourselves, would this person still serve if they never received the title? If they were never the children's ministry director, would they still serve? And if the answer is yes, you're probably seeing evidence of genuine faithfulness. So we depend on God. We assess the heart. We verify faithfulness. And then we invest through opportunity. Because identification isn't enough. We need to intentionally create opportunities for emerging leaders to grow. So you know what? Invite them into ministry. Allow them to teach. Have them lead a prayer. Have them visit with someone at the hospital. Allow them to serve with experienced leaders. And while they do so, observe how they respond. Because responsibility has a way of revealing maturity. Because in that moment, some people will flourish and some, well, you'll catch a glimpse of where growth is needed. And both of those are valuable. Either one of those. Because leadership isn't developed only in classrooms. It's developed while serving. So once again, we depend on God. We assess the heart. We verify faithfulness. We invest through opportunity. And then we develop intentionally. Because finding David is only the beginning. Because once David was anointed, he didn't automatically become king and say, okay, all right, I'm ready for my palace. Put me there. I'm ready to rule. No, he went through years of preparation. And leadership development does not happen accidentally. Healthy churches don't just hope that leaders appear. No, they intentionally develop systems that mentor, that disciple, that equip, that reproduce future leaders. Because again, this purpose isn't to just simply identify potential leaders. It's to intentionally develop these leaders who will then, hear me, reproduce and invest in others. Because leadership isn't merely about filling positions. It's about multiplying people. So I want to leave you with one final challenge today. Somewhere in your church, there's a David. And he may be greeting at the door. He may be running the sound booth. He may just be serving in obscurity, thinking that nobody sees him. And you know what? That's fine. Because while you may not have seen him, God does. And our responsibility as pastors and church leaders is not to manufacture leaders, but it's to recognize the men that God is already shaping and intentionally invest in them before leadership vacancies ever arise. Remember the David process. Depend on God, assess the heart, verify faithfulness, invest through opportunity, and finally develop intentionally. If churches become intentional about identifying leaders before they need leaders, they won't simply just fill leadership positions. They will build a culture where leadership is continually reproduced for generations to come. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation. And I want to leave you again with this. Find that David in your ministry.